Right, so as another ceasefire proposal, this time between Israel and Lebanon, falls through because Israel will never ever agree to one. I think that ought to be established by now. Thoughts turn to how such a thing might be forced. And of course, we all by now, I'm sure, quickly turn our thoughts to the US and how we might get around their incessant guardianship of Israel. Apparently now sending more troops to the Middle East, potentially. Who would bet against it with rampant, unapologetic Zionists like Biden and Blinken in charge? Sending them into Lebanon with Israel. I sincerely hope they aren't so stupid as to do that, but just in case they are, Turkey might actually have been the ones to finally land upon a solution, and it would really put the US between a rock and a hard place if their stance on Israel doesn't dramatically shift. Right, so this is so ridiculously, hilariously simple. I don't know why it hasn't come up in more serious discourse. And what makes this worse is that it's actually something that came up back at the end of July. Maybe it is because despite being highlighted then by Turkey, it hasn't actually come to pass. There could be a good reason for that as well. An empty threat perhaps is all this amounts to there maybe, but it was well reported at the time. However, what wasn't was the consequences of this action should it actually come to pass in the near future, because it would stuff the US up royally, in theory at least, and a lot more besides. Come on, Damo, stop being so cryptic. What's the crack then, you might be thinking? Well, back at the end of July, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan threatened to invade Israel over its genocide in Gaza. This hasn't happened yet, as we know. We're a couple of months on from this. Yet who's to say it wouldn't now that it is attacking Lebanon, maybe? The stakes have been raised somewhat, haven't they? And Israel's genocidal tendencies and determination to expand war in the Middle East has ratcheted up another gear. There's been a lot of tit for tat going on between the leadership of Turkey and Israel. And following Erdogan's threat in July, you can imagine Israel didn't take kindly to it, as this excerpt from Al Jazeera shows. A war of words has broken out between Israel and Turkey after President Recep Tayyip Erdogan threatened his country could intervene militarily in Israel's war on Gaza. Turkish and Israeli officials unleashed barbs at one another on Sunday and Monday after Erdogan said in a speech on Sunday that there is no reason that Turkey could not act, noting military interventions made in the past in other countries. While crude rhetoric between the two countries has been regular amid the war in Gaza, the threats and insults come as fears of a wider escalation rise once again. Shortly after Erdogan's speech, Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz said in a post on X that the Turkish president was following in the footsteps of former Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein by threatening to attack Israel. Just let him remember what happened there and how it ended, he wrote in reference to the Iraqi president's infamous 2003 capture by the United States forces whilst hiding in a hole in the ground near a farmhouse in Tikrit. Hussein was later executed. In retaliation, Turkey, not for the first time, compared Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to Adolf Hitler. Just as genocidal Hitler ended, so will genocidal Netanyahu, said the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Calling one leader Saddam Hussein results in the other being called Hitler. You can imagine this going on in a playground setting almost, can't you? But that belies the seriousness of how bad relations have deteriorated between the two nations. But the crux of this video, and how the US might be dragged in, wrong-footed and forced into a box, comes down fundamentally as to whether Turkey does make good on its threat to invade. They do have form for it, meaning that this isn't necessarily an idle threat. For example, subsequent to the collapse of Libya following the end of the Gaddafi administration in 2011, the country fell to pieces. The likes of the US and the UK not bothering to put the country back on its feet following their military intervention, and Turkey was part of that as well. But by 2020, a UN-approved administration in Libya, whatever you think of such a phrase, had risen, but was being challenged by a rival administration, and Turkey once more intervened militarily for a short time to see the UN's pick end up come out on top, or worked towards that, shall we say. But let's consider this happening with regards to Israel if Turkey invades them. It's not the UN so much that is a consideration here in this instance, but NATO. Say Turkey invades Israel, though. Turkey is a NATO country, just as the US is, just as we are here in the UK. But Israel is not. And seeing the potential danger a Turkish invasion could represent, Israel, just days after Erdogan's threat to invade back in July, urged NATO to throw Turkey out. Now, why would that be? Well, here's the trouble. There's no mechanism in place whatsoever to throw any nation-state out of NATO, not even to suspend them. There's literally no instance where it can be done. It cannot be, because it undermines the inherent trust that's necessary between all NATO countries that they would always have each other's back should the threat of a global war once again appear. And it is for this reason that the US would be in such an impossible bind, it seems, or in theory, if Turkey invaded Israel, because under the terms of their membership of NATO, they would be obliged to aid their NATO counterpart member. Should Israel respond and directly attack Turkey, that would be. An attack on one NATO member is an attack on all, as the saying goes. And let's face it, Israel seems to much prefer civilian targets to military ones. What would the United States do in which instance then? Break with Israel or break with NATO? Can you imagine the fallout, for example, with regards to Russia and Ukraine right now, if the US sided with Israel against Turkey, against NATO? And I absolutely believe that is actually what they would do. But that would undermine the entire reason for having NATO entirely. The member state with the biggest army going rogue against the member state with the second biggest army, actually, because that is actually Turkey. And again, all to save Israel's face. The rock and hard place it would put the US in would only force their hand and tell the world that this is who they are and this is what they would do, even as things get that extreme. The theory that the US is obligated under NATO to come to Turkey's aid instead wouldn't happen, I don't think, because of how undermined US politics is by the Israel lobby. And actually, this is probably why Turkey haven't actually invaded in the end, haven't followed through in that threat, to my mind anyway. Where the US would be obligated to help them, they almost certainly wouldn't. The US serves itself first and foremost, not to mention Israel. Ultimately, instead of bringing Israel to heel, the wider war Israel wants is probably what would actually end up happening instead, which serves nobody's interest save Netanyahu's, who would no doubt then start playing the victim card as hard as possible, though I doubt it would have quite the same effect with its attacks on Gaza and Lebanon now ongoing in the eyes of the rest of the world. It might expose the US as having no bigger loyalty to anyone anywhere than to Israel. It will have made life difficult for them for a fair old bit, but it wouldn't lead to a solution. It wouldn't lead to peace. No talk of an invasion actually ever could. So although this was an entertaining thought experiment, that is, as far as things go at this point, with Turkey not actually having carried out its threat. That is, unless Erdogan does make good on his threat at some point, and he is the president of Turkey, and you can't dismiss that notion entirely, and then all bets will of course be off. NATO or Israel, you can justifiably criticise both bodies, both entities, but concluding the US would dump NATO for Israel is where I think this would end up. Do you agree or disagree with that? Do let me know in the comments. Meanwhile, Israel ploughs on regardless. No interest in ceasefires, no interest in stopping. Netanyahu's job depends on keeping war going, doesn't it? Justifying it until the next set of elections if he doesn't excuse himself from calling them at all because of his war. This now includes plans to ethnically cleanse northern Gaza, of course, but where the media sensationalise such an act, as well as some justifying it even, they've missed the fact that this is exactly what the settler movement in Israel have proposed and wanted for months and months and months now. The beginning of settling Gaza once again, as this video recommendation will tell you all about this. I'm sure it's coincidence. All about as your recommended next watch. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.